Ángel Maturino Reséndiz crouched behind a metal electrical box near the University of Kentucky Railroad tracks on August 29, 1997, watching and waiting. The 38-year-old drifter from Mexico had been riding freight trains across America for decades, jumping on and off boxcars in the dead of night, sleeping under overpasses, stealing food from homes near railroad tracks. But tonight, as he watched 21-year-old Christopher Meyer and 20-year-old Holly Dunn walking hand in hand back to a party, he wasn't thinking about survival or food. He was thinking about murder. When the young couple passed his hiding spot, Ángel emerged from the shadows wielding a wooden board and attacked Christopher from behind, knocking him unconscious with a single, brutal blow. Before Holly could scream or run, Ángel was on her too, striking her in the head and face, dragging both victims down an embankment away from the tracks. He bound their hands with shoelaces and belts, tying them so tightly the bindings cut into their skin. Then, as Holly drifted in and out of consciousness, Ángel walked away into the darkness. She heard his footsteps fading, heard him rustling through brush and debris, and then heard him returning. He was dragging something heavy. When Ángel stood over Christopher's prone body, he was holding a 50-pound piece of limestone rock, jagged and rough. He lifted it above his head with both hands and brought it down onto Christopher's skull. The sound was sickening, a wet crack that echoed through the night. But Ángel didn't stop. He lifted the rock again and brought it down, again and again and again. 10 times he smashed that rock into Christopher Meyer's head until the young man's skull was completely crushed, his brain matter spreading across the dirt and gravel. Then Ángel turned his attention to Holly. He raped her. He stabbed her in the neck with an ice pick he carried in his jacket. He beat her face with his fists until she was unrecognizable, and then he left her there next to her boyfriend's mutilated corpse, believing she was dead, or would die before anyone found her. But Holly Dunn survived. She crawled up the embankment, bleeding and broken, and flagged down a passing car. She became the only known survivor of a serial killer who would murder at least 15 people, possibly as many as 23, across 6 states over nearly 2 decades. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz earned the nickname the Railroad Killer because he used America's vast freight train system to move between murders, hopping trains that carried him from Texas to Illinois to Kentucky to California to Georgia, killing elderly couples, doctors, kindergarten teachers, pastors, and their wives, anyone unfortunate enough to live near railroad tracks and leave their doors or windows unlocked. He entered victims' homes in the middle of the night, beat them to death with whatever blunt object was available, a sledgehammer, a pickaxe, a statue, a bronze weight, then ate their food, took showers, stole jewelry and valuables, and laid out their driver's licenses to study their lives before catching the next train out of town. The FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. America's Most Wanted featured him in multiple episodes, and his own sister, terrified he would kill again and desperate to save him from himself, negotiated his surrender to Texas Rangers in exchange for $86,000 in reward money and a promise that he would receive psychiatric evaluation rather than immediate execution. At his trial in 2000, Ángel Reséndiz confessed to 9 murders, but claimed he was an angel of God sent to punish evil people, that voices in his head commanded him to kill, that he was insane and couldn't be held responsible. But the jury didn't believe him. They saw through his act and recognized him for what he was, a cold-blooded serial killer who murdered for sex, for power, for control, and for the thrill of watching people die. He was convicted of capital murder, sentenced to death, and executed by lethal injection on June 27, 2006. His last words, spoken with a smirk on his face, were, "I deserve what I am getting." This is the forgotten story of the Railroad Killer, the Mexican drifter who terrorized America while living in the shadows of the train tracks that crisscross the nation. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Ángel Leoncio Reyes Reséndiz was born on August 1, 1959, in Izúcar de Matamoros, Puebla, Mexico, a small agricultural town approximately 75 miles southeast of Mexico City. He was one of 7 children born to an impoverished family struggling to survive in one of the poorest regions of Mexico. His father abandoned the family when Ángel was very young, leaving his mother alone to raise 7 children with no income, no education, and no support system. The family lived in conditions that are difficult for Americans to comprehend. A single-room shack with dirt floors, no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing. They subsisted on whatever food could be grown in a tiny garden plot, or bought with the few pesos Angel's mother earned doing laundry for wealthier families in town. Angel's childhood was marked by extreme poverty, hunger, neglect, and abuse. His mother worked from dawn until dark and had little time or energy for her children. Various male relatives moved in and out of the household, most of them abusive alcoholics who beat the children for minor infractions or for no reason at all. Ángel later told psychiatrists that he was sexually abused by an older cousin when he was 8 years old, an experience that left him feeling powerless, ashamed, and filled with rage. School was sporadic at best. Ángel attended classes occasionally, but dropped out permanently around age 12 to work in the fields alongside migrant laborers, picking crops for pennies per day. By age 15, Ángel had left home entirely, living on the streets of various Mexican cities, surviving by stealing, begging, and doing odd jobs. He developed a pattern that would define his entire life. Constant movement, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments or be held accountable for his actions. He rode freight trains throughout Mexico, jumping on and off boxcars, sleeping in rail yards, eating whatever he could steal or find discarded. He learned the rhythms of the railroads, which trains went where and when, how to avoid railroad security, where to hide when authorities came around. The trains became his home, his transportation, and eventually his hunting ground. In 1976, at age 17, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz crossed into the United States for the first time. He had taken his mother's maiden name and his stepfather's surname by this point, calling himself Ángel Maturino Reséndiz rather than his birth name of Ángel Leoncio Reyes Reséndiz. He entered Texas illegally, simply walking across the Rio Grande at a point where the border was unwatched and unguarded. Once in the United States, Ángel discovered that the opportunities for survival and theft were far greater than they had been in Mexico. He found work as a migrant farm laborer, moving from Texas to California to Florida, picking fruits and vegetables alongside other undocumented workers for cash wages that were low by American standards, but seemed like riches compared to what he could earn in Mexico. But Ángel wasn't content just to work. He stole from the farm labor camps where he stayed, taking wallets, jewelry, tools, anything he could sell or pawn. He broke into homes near the camps, taking food, money, clothing. He developed a methodology that would serve him well in his later murders. He targeted homes near railroad tracks where trains slowed down or stopped. Homes where he could approach unseen, break in through an unlocked door or window, take what he wanted, and disappear onto the next freight train before anyone knew he'd been there. Ángel's first known arrest came in 1976, just months after entering the United States, when he was caught burglarizing a home in Palm Beach County, Florida. He was convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison, serving his time in a Florida state facility before being released and deported back to Mexico in 1977. But deportation meant nothing to Ángel. Within weeks, he was back in the United States, having simply walked across the border again at a different location. This pattern, arrest, conviction, deportation, illegal re-entry, would repeat itself throughout the 1980s and 1990s. By the time Ángel began his murder spree, he had been arrested and deported at least 4 times, possibly more. Each time, he used a different name, a different birth date, claiming to be someone else. Immigration officials had no way to connect the multiple deportations to the same person, because there was no centralized database, no fingerprint sharing between agencies, no way to track individuals who used multiple identities. During the 1980s, while moving back and forth between Mexico and the United States, Ángel married a woman named Julieta Dominguez Reyes in Rodeo, Durango, Mexico. Julieta came from a poor family like Ángel, and their courtship was brief. They married in 1982 when Ángel was 23 years old, and Julieta soon became pregnant with their daughter. But Ángel was rarely home. He continued his pattern of riding freight trains, working seasonal jobs, stealing, and moving constantly. He would disappear for months at a time, leaving Julieta and their daughter alone, with no money and no way to contact him. When he did return, he brought stolen jewelry and items he claimed to have found or bought, gifts for his wife and mother that were actually taken from the homes of people he had burglarized or eventually murdered. Angel's escalation from burglary to violence likely occurred gradually throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, though because he was never caught, and because many crimes went unreported or were attributed to other suspects, the exact timeline is unclear. What is known is that Ángel had several arrests for assault during this period. Bar fights, domestic disputes, attacks on other migrant workers. In each case, he was either released with a fine or served brief jail sentences before being deported again. The pattern of violence was escalating, but no one connected the dots or recognized that this repeat deportee was becoming increasingly dangerous. The first murder conclusively attributed to Ángel Maturino Reséndiz occurred on August 29, 1997, in Lexington, Kentucky. The attack on Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn that left Christopher dead and Holly barely alive. But investigators would later determine that Ángel had almost certainly killed before this night. Unsolved murders dating back to the early 1990s bore the hallmarks of his methodology. Victims found in homes near railroad tracks, killed with blunt force trauma using objects found at the scene. Homes ransacked, but with money sometimes left behind. And most tellingly, driver's licenses laid out on tables or dressers, as if the killer had been studying his victims' identities. Christopher Meyer was a 21-year-old junior at the University of Kentucky, majoring in engineering, and planning a future that would never come to pass. Friends and family described Chris as funny, kind, athletic, and genuinely good. The kind of person who made everyone around him feel valued and included. He was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, played intramural sports, volunteered at a local homeless shelter, and had recently started dating Holly Dunn, a 20-year-old sophomore whom he'd met through mutual friends. Holly Dunn was studying at the University of Kentucky with plans to major in communications. She was from Indiana, the daughter of a close-knit family who had instilled in her strong values and a positive outlook on life. Holly was outgoing, smart, and ambitious. She had dreams of working in television or public relations, making a difference in the world. On the night of August 29, 1997, Holly and Chris attended a party at a fraternity house near campus. Around midnight, they decided to leave and walk back to Chris's apartment. Chris suggested they take a shortcut through a wooded area near the railroad tracks, a route students often used late at night to avoid the longer walk along well-lit but circuitous streets. As Chris and Holly walked hand in hand along the gravel path beside the tracks, talking and laughing, neither had any idea they were being watched. Ángel Reséndiz had jumped off a freight train earlier that evening and had been prowling the area looking for a home to burglarize. When he saw the young couple walking alone in the darkness, he saw opportunity. He hid behind an electrical junction box and waited, a wooden board in his hands, watching as they approached. The attack happened so fast that Holly barely had time to register what was occurring. Ángel leaped from his hiding place and swung the board at Chris's head, connecting with tremendous force. Chris crumpled to the ground immediately, unconscious. Holly screamed and tried to run, but Ángel caught her, hitting her in the head and face with the board until she fell. He dragged both victims down a steep embankment, away from the tracks where someone might see them from a passing train or car. He tied Chris's hands behind his back with shoelaces he removed from Chris's own shoes. He tied Holly's hands behind her back with her own belt. Both victims were drifting in and out of consciousness, disoriented, in shock. Then, Ángel left them there and walked off into the woods. Holly later testified that she heard him moving away, heard branches breaking, heard what sounded like something being dragged. When Ángel returned, he was carrying the large piece of limestone rock. Without saying a word, without any preamble, he positioned himself over Chris's prone body and lifted the rock above his head. Holly, lying just feet away with her hands bound behind her back, could only watch in horror as Ángel brought the rock down onto Chris's skull. The first impact killed Chris, or at the very least rendered him brain dead. But Ángel didn't stop. He lifted the rock and brought it down again, and again, and again. Holly screamed, begged him to stop, told him he didn't have to do this. Ángel ignored her. By the time he was finished, Chris's head had been completely destroyed, his skull shattered into pieces, his brain exposed. The medical examiner would later count at least 10 separate impacts from the rock, though it was difficult to determine the exact number, given the extent of the damage. After murdering Chris, Ángel turned his full attention to Holly. He removed her clothing from the waist down. He raped her. He stabbed her in the neck with an ice pick, the point puncturing her skin and narrowly missing her carotid artery. He beat her face with his fists, breaking her nose, fracturing her orbital bone, splitting her lips. He told her in broken English that she was going to die, that no one would find her, that she deserved this for being out alone with a man at night. Then he tied her ankles together, checked to make sure her wrists were still securely bound, and left her there beside Chris's body. Holly lay there in the darkness, bleeding, broken, certain she was going to die. She could feel the blood pooling beneath her from the stab wound in her neck. Her face was so swollen she could barely see or breathe. Her hands and feet were numb from the circulation being cut off by the bindings. And next to her lay Chris, the man she had been falling in love with, his head destroyed, his blood soaking into the ground. But Holly Dunn did not give up. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she began trying to free her hands. The belt Ángel had used to bind her wrists was tight, but Holly was able to flex her hands and pull, working the leather through the buckle millimeter by millimeter. It took over an hour of painful effort, but she eventually got one hand free, then the other. She untied her ankles. She tried to wake Chris, shaking him, calling his name, but he was gone. Holly somehow found the strength to crawl up the embankment, up the steep slope to the gravel path beside the tracks. She crawled along the tracks toward the lights of the nearby road, leaving a trail of blood behind her. At approximately 3 a.m., 2 college students driving home from a late-night study session saw a figure crawling along the side of the road near the railroad underpass. They stopped, at first thinking it was someone who had been hit by a car. When they got closer and saw Holly's condition, they immediately called 911. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived. Holly was conscious but barely able to speak through her swollen, broken face. She managed to tell the first responders that she and her boyfriend had been attacked, that her boyfriend was dead, that the attacker had gone. She described the location where Chris's body could be found. Police discovered Christopher Myers' body exactly where Holly had described, his corpse already cooling, his head so destroyed that identification would require dental records. The crime scene was a nightmare, blood everywhere, the massive limestone rock lying next to Chris's body, Holly's torn clothing scattered around, signs of a violent struggle. Detectives knew immediately they were dealing with someone extremely dangerous, someone capable of extraordinary brutality. Holly Dunn spent 5 days in the hospital recovering from her physical injuries, the stab wound, the facial fractures, the cuts and bruises covering her body. But the psychological wounds would take far longer to heal. She suffered from severe PTSD, nightmares, depression, and survivor's guilt. Why had she lived when Chris had died? Why had Ángel left her alive? For years, Holly struggled with these questions, undergoing therapy and working to rebuild her life despite the trauma. But Holly was also determined that her survival would mean something, that Chris's death would not be in vain. She became a passionate advocate for victims of violent crime, eventually founding Holly's House, a non-profit organization providing support services to survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. She also became a key witness in bringing Ángel Reséndiz to justice, testifying at his trial about what he had done to her and Chris, ensuring that the jury understood the full horror of his crimes. The investigation into Chris Meyer's murder initially stalled. Lexington police had no suspects, no leads, and no way to identify the killer. Holly had provided a description: Hispanic male, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, thin build, wearing dark clothing. But this description could have fit hundreds of people in the area. DNA evidence was collected from the rape kit, but in 1997, DNA databases were far less comprehensive than they are today, and the sample didn't match anyone in the system. The case went cold, filed away as an unsolved murder with the hope that someday, somehow, new evidence would emerge. What investigators didn't know was that Ángel Reséndiz had jumped on a southbound freight train within hours of the attack and was already hundreds of miles away by the time the sun rose. He rode that train back to Texas, jumped off in Houston, and within days was back in Mexico visiting his wife and mother. He gave his wife jewelry he had stolen from previous burglaries, told her he'd been working construction in California, and acted as if nothing had happened. Then, after just a week at home, he was gone again, riding the trains back into the United States to continue his spree. Over the next year and a half, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz would kill at least 8 more people, possibly more, in attacks that followed a chillingly consistent pattern. He would ride freight trains through the night, watching for homes located near the tracks. When a train slowed down or stopped, he would jump off and approach homes on foot, checking doors and windows until he found one that was unlocked. He would enter in the middle of the night, find the occupants asleep in their beds, and attack them with whatever blunt object was readily available: a sledgehammer from the garage, a pickaxe from a tool shed, a bronze sculpture from the mantel, a tire iron from the car. The attacks were brutal and prolonged. Ángel didn't just kill his victims, he obliterated them, striking them dozens of times even after they were clearly dead. After the murders, Ángel would linger in the homes for hours, sometimes for an entire day. He would take showers, eat food from the refrigerator, watch television, sleep in the victims' beds. He would go through their belongings, taking jewelry, cash, credit cards, and small valuables. Strangely, he often left large amounts of cash behind. On several occasions, victims were found with hundreds of dollars in their wallets untouched, even though Ángel had clearly gone through their belongings. This puzzled investigators until they realized that Ángel's motive wasn't primarily financial. He killed for the act of killing itself, for the power and control it gave him over others' lives. One of Ángel's most disturbing rituals was laying out his victims' driver's licenses on tables or dressers and studying them. Police would find licenses positioned carefully, sometimes propped up against objects so they were clearly visible, as if Ángel had been sitting and examining them. When asked about this during his interrogation, Ángel explained that he wanted to know about the people he killed, wanted to understand their lives. This was not remorse or empathy. It was a serial killer's grotesque fascination with his own power to end lives, to study the faces of people who would never see another sunrise because of him. On October 2, 1998, Ángel murdered Leafy Mason, an 87-year-old woman in Hughes Springs, Texas. Leafy was a beloved grandmother who lived alone in a modest house located just 100 yards from railroad tracks. She was known throughout the community for her kindness, her beautiful garden, and her dedication to her church. On the morning of October 2nd, neighbors noticed that Leafy's newspapers had piled up on her front porch, and that her curtains were still drawn at noon. Unusual for a woman who was always up early tending her garden. When police performed a welfare check, they found Leafy dead in her bed, beaten to death with a steam iron that had been taken from her own closet. The medical examiner counted at least 20 separate blows to her head and face. The house had been ransacked, but again, money was left behind. Leafy had over $200 in her purse, untouched. Her driver's license was found on the kitchen table, positioned upright, and surrounded by jewelry and personal items Ángel had taken from her bedroom. Railroad detectives noted that a freight train had been stopped on the nearby tracks for approximately 4 hours the night before Leafy's murder. Plenty of time for someone to jump off, commit the murder, and return to the train. Less than 2 months later, on December 17, 1998, Ángel murdered Dr. Claudia Benton in her home in West University Place, an affluent neighborhood in Houston, Texas. Dr. Benton, 39, was a pediatric neurologist at Baylor College of Medicine, a brilliant physician dedicated to treating children with neurological disorders. She lived with her husband and 2 young daughters in a beautiful home, but that home was located less than a quarter mile from railroad tracks. On the night of December 17th, Dr. Benton's husband and daughters were out of town, visiting relatives for the Christmas holidays. Claudia had stayed behind to work, planning to join her family the following day. Ángel, who had been watching the house and had seen the family leave, broke in through an unlocked window after midnight. He found Claudia asleep in her bed and attacked her with a bronze statue he found in the living room, a 19-pound sculpture that became a murder weapon. The medical examiner would later determine that Claudia had been struck 19 times, once for each pound of the weapon. She had died a slow, agonizing death, conscious for at least part of the attack, her hands showing defensive wounds where she had tried to shield herself. After murdering Dr. Benton, Ángel spent hours in the house. He ate food from the kitchen, tried on Dr. Benton's husband's clothes, took a shower, and went through the family's belongings. He stole Dr. Benton's wedding ring, several pieces of jewelry, and a small amount of cash. Then he did something that would prove crucial to his eventual capture. He drove away in Dr. Benton's car, a silver Honda, taking it approximately 30 miles before abandoning it in a grocery store parking lot. This was uncharacteristic. Ángel typically fled crime scenes on foot and returned to the trains. By taking the car, he left physical evidence that would eventually link him to the crime. The murder of Dr. Claudia Benton marked a turning point in the investigation of what law enforcement was now calling the Railroad Killer murders. Houston Police Department, working with the FBI and Texas Rangers, had begun connecting the dots between multiple unsolved murders across several states, all occurring near railroad tracks, all involving blunt force trauma, all with similar patterns of behavior by the killer. The FBI created a task force to coordinate investigations across jurisdictions, sharing information and evidence that might link the cases. On December 23, 1998, just 6 days after murdering Dr. Benton, Ángel was arrested in San Antonio, Texas for burglary. He had broken into a home near railroad tracks and was caught by the homeowner, who held him at gunpoint until police arrived. Ángel was booked into the Bexar County Jail under the name Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, one of approximately 30 aliases he had used over the years. DNA evidence was collected as part of standard booking procedures. Ángel posted bail and disappeared before his court date, jumping on a train and fleeing Texas before anyone realized who he really was. That DNA sample sat in an evidence locker for several months before being processed and entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. In March 1999, it matched DNA recovered from the Dr. Claudia Benton crime scene. Suddenly, law enforcement had a name, Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, and a face to attach to the railroad killer murders. The man they had been hunting for months had been in custody just weeks after the Benton murder, but had been released because no one had connected him to the crime. But Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez was yet another alias. Ángel had used different names, different birth dates, and different identifying information each time he was arrested or deported, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track his movements or build a comprehensive criminal history. Immigration records showed at least 4 deportations of individuals matching Ángel's description and fingerprints, but each deportation was filed under a different name, with no cross-referencing. As investigators dug deeper into Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, they began to uncover the full scope of the railroad killer's crimes. In Texas alone, They identified at least 5 murders that matched his methodology. In Illinois, there were 2 more. In Kentucky, the Christopher Meyer case. In Georgia, possibly another. In California, several unsolved cases bore striking similarities. The FBI estimated that Ángel Maturino Reséndiz had killed at least 15 people, possibly as many as 23, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. On May 13, 1999, Ángel murdered Reverend Norman "Skip" Cernick, 46, and his wife Karen Cernick, 47, in their parsonage in Weimar, Texas. Reverend Cernick was the pastor of the United Church of Christ in Weimar, a small town of about 2,000 people located, yes, near railroad tracks. The Cernicks were beloved in their community, known for their compassion, their dedication to serving others, and their open-door policy that welcomed anyone who needed help or spiritual guidance. On the evening of May 13th, the Cernicks were asleep in their bed when Ángel broke in through an unlocked door. He attacked them with a sledgehammer he found in their garage, killing both in their bed. The medical examiner determined that Karen had been struck at least 10 times, and Skip at least 12 times. Both had defensive wounds showing they had tried to fight off their attacker. After the murders, Ángel took a shower in the parsonage, ate food from the kitchen, and stole several items including Karen's wedding ring. He laid out both victims' driver's licenses on the nightstand next to the bed where their bodies lay. The bodies weren't discovered until May 15th, when parishioners became concerned that Reverend Cernick hadn't shown up for a scheduled church meeting. When they entered the parsonage and found the horrific scene, the small town of Weimar was traumatized. That a man of God and his wife could be murdered in their own home, in the parsonage of a church, by a stranger who had ridden in on a train. It shattered any remaining sense of safety people in small railroad towns had been clinging to. Just 3 weeks later, on June 4, 1999, Ángel murdered Noemi Dominguez, 26, in Houston, Texas. Noemi was a young teacher's aide who lived with her elderly parents in a house, once again, located near railroad tracks. Ángel broke into the home in the middle of the night and attacked Noemi as she slept, beating her to death with a pickaxe he found in the backyard shed. The attack woke Noemi's father, who confronted Ángel. Ángel struck the 73-year-old man with the pickaxe but did not kill him. The father would survive his injuries and provide the first detailed description of the railroad killer to police. Finally, law enforcement had a living witness who could describe the attacker in detail. The father described a thin Hispanic man, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, with intense dark eyes and a calm, almost serene demeanor, even while committing murder. "He looked at me," the father later told police, "and he smiled. He was killing my daughter, and he smiled at me." This description, combined with the DNA evidence and the mounting body count, confirmed that Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, real name Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, was the railroad killer, and he needed to be stopped before he killed again. On June 15, 1999, Ángel murdered George Morber Sr., 80, and his daughter Carolyn Frederick, 51, in their home in Gorham, Illinois. The home was located approximately 100 yards from railroad tracks. Ángel broke in through an unlocked door, found George asleep in his bed, and shot him in the head with George's own shotgun. When Carolyn heard the gunshot and came running, Ángel beat her to death with the shotgun. After the murders, he sexually assaulted Carolyn's body and spent several hours in the house eating, showering, and going through their belongings. The Morber Frederick murders brought the death toll to at least 13 confirmed victims, with strong circumstantial evidence linking Ángel to several other unsolved murders. On June 21, 1999, the FBI added Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez to the 10 most wanted fugitives list, offering a $125,000 reward for information leading to his capture. America's Most Wanted aired a special episode about the railroad killer, featuring interviews with survivors and families of victims, photographs and composite sketches of the suspect, and desperate pleas for anyone with information to come forward. But Ángel Maturino Reséndiz remained at large, continuing to ride the trains, continuing to evade capture. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states set up checkpoints at rail yards, searched freight trains, and interviewed hundreds of transients and railroad workers. But the American freight rail system is massive. Over 140,000 miles of track crisscrossing 49 states, and Ángel knew how to disappear into that vast network. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Ángel's sister, Manuela Reyes, who lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Manuela had seen the America's Most Wanted episode and recognized her brother immediately. She was horrified by what he had done, but also terrified that he would kill again. And she knew that if he was caught in the act of committing another murder, police would likely shoot him on sight. Despite everything Ángel had done, Manuela loved her brother and wanted to save his life if possible. Through an attorney, Manuela contacted the FBI and offered to help facilitate Ángel's surrender. She had one condition. She wanted assurances that her brother would receive psychiatric evaluation rather than being immediately tried and executed. And she wanted the $86,000 in reward money that had been offered by various law enforcement agencies. The FBI agreed to both conditions. They had been hunting Ángel for months with no success. And if his own sister could convince him to surrender, it would be worth the reward money and the promise of psychiatric evaluation. Texas Ranger Drew Carter was assigned to negotiate with Ángel through Manuela. Over several weeks, Manuela made contact with her brother in Mexico, where he had fled after the Illinois murders. She told him that police were going to kill him if he was caught, that his only chance of survival was to surrender voluntarily. She told him that Ranger Carter had promised he would not be harmed if he gave himself up peacefully, and critically, she told him that if he surrendered, he would receive mental health treatment and evaluation that might help him avoid the death penalty. Ángel was skeptical at first, but Manuela was persistent. She was his sister, and despite everything, he trusted her. On July 13, 1999, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz walked across the international bridge from Juarez, Mexico, to El Paso, Texas, and surrendered to Ranger Drew Carter. He was arrested without incident, handcuffed, and transported to a holding facility, while the FBI and Texas Rangers began the process of building their case for prosecution. The capture of the railroad killer made national headlines. After months of terror, after at least 15 murders, after one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was finally in custody. But the legal process was just beginning, and it would take years to bring him to trial and deliver justice for his victims. Ángel was charged with capital murder in the death of Dr. Claudia Benton, the crime for which prosecutors believed they had the strongest evidence. The trial began in April 2000 in Houston, Texas, before Judge Bill Harmon. Ángel's defense team, led by Alan Tanner, faced an impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. DNA evidence linking him to multiple murders, fingerprints found at crime scenes, stolen property recovered from his wife and mother in Mexico, testimony from Holly Dunn and from the father who had survived the attack that killed his daughter, and most damning of all, Ángel's own confession. Yes, after his arrest, Ángel had confessed to 9 murders, providing details that only the killer could have known. But his confessions were inconsistent and often bizarre. He claimed he was an angel sent by God to punish evil people. He said voices in his head commanded him to kill. He described elaborate religious visions and delusions. The defense strategy was clear. They would argue that Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was legally insane at the time of the murders and therefore could not be held criminally responsible for his actions. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lynn McClellan, systematically destroyed the insanity defense. They called psychiatric experts who had evaluated Ángel and determined that he did not meet the legal definition of insanity. Dr. Boyd Stevens testified that while Ángel might have some mental health issues, he knew right from wrong, understood the consequences of his actions, and had made calculated choices to murder, rape, and rob his victims. The fact that Ángel had been able to evade capture for so long, that he had used multiple aliases, that he had methodically planned his crimes and covered his tracks. All demonstrated that he had full cognitive functioning and understood that what he was doing was wrong. The prosecution also presented evidence of premeditation and planning. Ángel had carried tools with him: the ice pick he used to stab Holly Dunn, the gloves he wore during some attacks, the bag he used to carry stolen items. He had targeted homes near railroad tracks specifically because they provided easy access and escape routes. He had waited until victims were asleep or vulnerable before attacking. These were not the actions of someone in the grip of psychotic delusions. These were the calculated actions of a predator. Holly Dunn's testimony was particularly powerful. She described in excruciating detail what Ángel had done to her and Chris, how he had methodically beaten Chris to death while she watched helplessly, how he had raped and stabbed her and left her to die. She looked directly at Ángel as she testified, forcing him to see the human face of his crimes. Ángel showed no emotion during her testimony, staring straight ahead as if he wasn't even listening. The families of the other victims also testified during the punishment phase of the trial. They described the loved ones they had lost: the elderly grandmother, the dedicated doctor, the beloved pastor and his wife, the young teacher's aide. They spoke about the holes left in their lives, the milestones that would never be celebrated, the grandchildren who would grow up without grandparents, the patients who had lost a dedicated physician. Their impact statements were gut-wrenching, and several jurors were seen crying as they listened. On May 18, 2000, after deliberating for approximately 13 hours, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of capital murder. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence in Texas: death or life in prison without possibility of parole. The jury deliberated for an additional 2 hours on the punishment phase before returning with their decision: death. Judge Bill Harmon formally sentenced Ángel Maturino Reséndiz to death by lethal injection. Ángel showed no reaction to the sentence. He was transported to the Polunsky unit in West Livingston, Texas, which houses Texas's death row inmates, to await execution while his attorneys pursued the mandatory appeals process. Over the next 6 years, Ángel's defense team filed multiple appeals, challenging the conviction and death sentence. They argued that Ángel had not received adequate representation at trial, that the psychiatric evaluations were flawed, that he was mentally incompetent to be executed. Each appeal was denied. Courts consistently found that Ángel had received a fair trial, that the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, and that he understood the punishment he was facing and why he was being executed. During his time on death row, Ángel gave several interviews to journalists and documentary producers. He continued to claim he was insane, that voices had commanded him to kill, that he was an angel of God. But when pressed for details or asked to explain his actions, his story would change and contradict previous statements. Prison psychiatrists who evaluated him regularly reported that Ángel was manipulative, that his claims of insanity were exaggerated or fabricated, and that he showed no genuine remorse for his crimes. Holly Dunn, who had dedicated her life to victim advocacy after surviving Ángel's attack, closely followed the appeals process. She wanted to see justice served, wanted Ángel executed for what he had done. But she also struggled with the emotional toll of reliving the trauma with each new appeal, each new court hearing, each new media story about the railroad killer. In interviews, Holly spoke about the difficulty of healing when the person who tried to kill you is still alive, still making headlines, still finding ways to victimize you from behind bars. On June 27, 2006, all of Ángel Maturino Reséndiz's appeals were exhausted. An execution date was set, and barring a last-minute stay from the governor or the courts, the railroad killer would finally face the ultimate punishment for his crimes. Families of victims traveled to Huntsville, Texas, to witness the execution. Holly Dunn attended as well, determined to see this chapter of her life finally close. Ángel was brought into the execution chamber at the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville at approximately 7 p.m. He was strapped to a gurney, IVs inserted into his arms for the lethal injection drugs. Asked if he had any last words, Ángel looked directly at the witness gallery where victims' families sat and said, "Yes, I want to confess to those crimes. I am sorry. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life. I ask the forgiveness of those I hurt, and I ask the forgiveness of God. I deserved this. I know that I allowed the devil to rule my life. I am sorry. I hurt many people. I love my wife and my daughter. I ask God to forgive me. I deserve what I am getting." Then, as the drugs began to flow, Ángel looked at the ceiling and smiled. His last expression before losing consciousness was not one of remorse or fear. It was a smile. At 8:05 p.m., Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was pronounced dead. The railroad killer had been executed. In the years since Ángel's execution, the full scope of his crimes has continued to emerge. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states have reopened unsolved murders from the 1990s and early 2000s, re-examining them for possible links to the railroad killer. While Ángel confessed to 9 murders and was conclusively linked to 15, investigators believe the true number may be significantly higher, possibly 20 to 30 victims over nearly 2 decades. Many of these cases will never be definitively solved, because the only person who knew the full truth died in 2006. Holly Dunn continued her victim advocacy work, becoming a powerful voice for survivors of violent crime. She traveled across the country speaking at conferences, working with law enforcement to improve victim services, and helping to pass legislation strengthening penalties for violent offenders. In 2013, she published a memoir about her experience titled Soul Survivor, which became a bestseller and further raised awareness about the railroad killer case. Tragically, Holly Dunn died on August 17, 2016, at age 40, from complications related to breast cancer. Her death was mourned by the victim advocacy community and by law enforcement officials who had worked with her for nearly 2 decades. She was remembered not as a victim, but as a survivor, an advocate, and a hero who had turned unimaginable trauma into a mission to help others. The railroad killer case exposed serious flaws in how law enforcement agencies communicate across jurisdictions and how immigration officials track and deport repeat offenders. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz had been deported at least 4 times, yet each time he simply walked back across the border using a different name. There was no system in place to flag him as a violent criminal or to prevent his re-entry into the United States. After his capture, Congress passed legislation improving information sharing between immigration enforcement and criminal justice agencies, though implementation has been inconsistent. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of communities along railroad corridors. After the railroad killer murders, many small towns near major freight lines installed better security systems, organized neighborhood watch programs focused on areas near tracks, and worked with railroad companies to increase security patrols. The culture of leaving doors and windows unlocked, common in many small towns, shifted dramatically as residents realized that freight trains brought not just commerce, but also potential danger in the form of transients and criminals using the rails to travel. For the families of Ángel's victims, his execution brought some measure of closure, though the pain of their losses never fully healed. Christopher Meyer's parents established a scholarship fund in their son's name at the University of Kentucky, ensuring his memory would live on through helping other students achieve their dreams. Dr. Claudia Benton's family created a foundation supporting pediatric neurology research, continuing her life's work of helping children with neurological disorders. The Cernick family worked with their church to establish a ministry focused on crime victims and their families, turning their tragedy into a source of support for others experiencing similar trauma. The railroad killer murders remain one of the most horrific serial killer cases in American history, not because of the number of victims, which was sadly comparable to other serial killers, but because of the unique nature of the crimes. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz used the vast American freight rail system as his personal hunting ground, riding trains that carried him from state to state, killing wherever opportunity presented itself, and disappearing back onto the rails before law enforcement could respond. He was the ultimate transient predator, never staying in one place long enough to be caught, never forming patterns specific enough to predict his next move. The fact that it took law enforcement so long to recognize the pattern and connect the murders across jurisdictions speaks to the challenges of investigating crimes that cross state lines, especially when the perpetrator has no fixed address, uses multiple identities, and leaves minimal evidence at crime scenes. It was only through the coordination of the FBI, Texas Rangers, and local police departments across multiple states that the pattern was finally recognized and the manhunt organized. And in the end, it was not sophisticated police work or forensic evidence that led to Angel's capture. It was his own sister, desperate to save him from himself and from the death that surely awaited him if he continued killing. Manuela Leon Reyes made the difficult choice to betray her brother to save his life, and in doing so, she saved the lives of the unknown number of people Ángel would have killed if he had remained free. The story of the railroad killer is a forgotten one now, overshadowed by more recent crimes and more sensationalized killers. But those who lived through it, those who lost loved ones, those who survived his attacks, they have not forgotten. They remember the summer of 1999 when fear rode the rails across America. They remember the faces of the victims, the dedicated doctor and the beloved pastor, the elderly grandmother and the young college student, all of them murdered by a man who smiled as he died, taking whatever remained of his twisted psyche to the grave. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was executed in 2006, but his legacy of terror and death lives on in the communities he ravaged, the families he destroyed, and the systems that failed to stop him sooner. The railroad killer is gone, but he will never be forgotten.